Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Sperling. Thank you so much for joining us on episode 5 of All in Education's Sepas. I'd like to welcome today's experts. Back with us, we have Jeff Zatino. He is the Research and Policy Director at All in Education. Also with us today, we have David Brown, CEO of Valley Leadership and Home Matters Board Member, and Denise Resnick, CEO of First Place AZ, and also a Home Matters board member. Thank you so much. We'll get to the panel in just a moment, but I do want to mention All in Education is a local nonprofit organization that exists to build an Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Now, their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. Through the monthly series, Sepas, All in Education is working to bridge their advocacy efforts across multiple factors outside of the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. Now, they're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Sepas will focus on having real, thought-provoking conversations with leaders and community members and identify solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. Now, today's conversation will discuss a very critical issue that has been top of mind for many Arizonans and, in fact, across the country. Talk about housing today. As we've all seen in recent years, rents, home prices have skyrocketed, leaving many working families and individuals from our communities with little options to no options for a stable house. So it's evident here in our own state how big of a crisis access to affordable housing has become. Now, we've all seen an increase in homelessness, and many families have been pushed out of neighborhoods and communities where they have lived their entire lives. Now, this causes devastating impacts for students and their ability to have a stable experience in school. So before we start the panel, I do want to share a video. Let's hear from Gilbert.
One time I had experienced housing security was actually when I was in college. I lived in the dormitories for the first couple of years, but then it started to get too expensive. And my family and I had to make the hard decision that I could not live on campus anymore, and we had to find some new housing. And that whole transition was very stressful on my family and I. But for the very small percentage of Chicano and Latino students that actually make it to a university, a little over half of them graduate. And that is because when they hit those barriers, when they experience those barriers, sometimes they are not able to overcome it like I was able to. Well, I think what the general public gets wrong with housing insecurity is that it is determined at the individual level. This idea that as long as you work hard and that you're able to pull up your bootstraps, that you're going to be able to live in a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. And for many people, that is just not the case. There's a lot of public policy, again, talking about historical trauma here in Maricopa County and in the Valley. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, in the housing covenants and in the deeds, it had said that only white males could own and build houses here in the Valley. And that historical trauma still permeates to this day. Even up into the late 1980s, there were folks who were experiencing that historical trauma, were still living in parts of the Valley where there was lack of good quality schools, lack of access to healthy foods, and other vital resources needed to be able to live a fulfilling life. So the earliest memories of housing issues with my family goes back before I was born. My family and 6,000 other people lived west of Sky Harbor International Airport, and in the 1970s and 80s, the city of Phoenix implemented the West Approach land acquisition, where they voluntarily and involuntarily removed those folks from their homes. My grandfather was dying of cancer, and the day he died of cancer, the very next day, the city of Phoenix bulldozed our family's house. In the Adelante Fellowship, we talk a lot about historical trauma, and this was a prime example of historical trauma. Even though I was not alive when all this happened, it was just a few years before I was born, and those injustices that occurred with my family and with all those other community members still present barriers to things like education and housing even to this day. Now I think the general public is starting to see how important housing security is for someone to take control of their own life and to meet their own personal goals and fulfillment. I think those who want a deeper understanding of housing insecurity is to actually get involved with your local neighborhood association. Yes, you hear everyone say, you know, vote and things like that, and that is very important, but now it's your opportunity and our opportunity to get others to vote and to advocate for others to make this systemic change as it relates to housing insecurity.
All right, well, our special thanks to Gilbert for sharing that story. And Jeff, on that note, let's dive right in here. Why have you guys identified housing as a social determinant and how this factor impacts students?
For sure, thank you, Eric. So excited to be here. We understand that housing is at the center of a family's ability to provide safety and security and stability for their children and their family members. It's essential to the well-being of that family. In our reporting, in our MAPA report, we took a deep dive into redlining. Redlining being the government-sanctioned policy that limited access to home loans and financial services to areas of our own community that were deemed unworthy of investment. So this policy from the 50s and the 60s, what we have seen is that we've seen a segregation of Latino, Black, Indigenous people of color into certain areas of the community. Along with the segregation, we've seen high rates of poverty. And what this policy has created is an undervaluing of the local housing stock. So your property values plummet, which then becomes a challenge for us to levy property taxes in those housings so that we could reinvest those funds into the local school. So we're seeing high segregation, high poverty, highly burdened schools that are having a challenge in developing the education for our children, developing literacy skills, math skills that undercut their ability for upward mobility, right? So we're seeing this intergenerational poverty within these redlined communities. So housing is at the very center of a family's ability to create this nurturing home. It's the foundation to Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, water, and shelter.
Which is a great reason why you brought these two amazing leaders to the stage today. And Dave, I'll start with you. Talk about the work that you're doing at Home Matters and what that organization is and how it's impacting our community here locally.
Sure, and Jeff just did a great job articulating what it's all about. Really, nationally, we wanted to bring more attention to the importance of where you live. And so we created a national movement, which is really a story. Why is it important that we look at where families live, and when we think about where we want to build next, what are those elements? So we identified 5 that we feel make home a quality of life issue. It's not a subsidy, it's not 4 walls and a roof, it's your quality of life for your family or yourself. Home Matters for education, public safety, health, the economy, and then your own individual success. So we developed some programs nationally where we wanted to highlight the importance of home in those 5 areas. And then just recently here in Arizona, we launched the first statewide initiative of Home Matters with some help from Denise and a few leaders who met several Thursday mornings in a row to get it off the ground and think about how can we tell a story about the importance of home in Arizona. And really our lucky window, our opportunity we have in Arizona now to think about how we build going forward. Arizona, still a relatively young state. Maricopa County, still a relatively young county, and you think of the rest of the city's 5th largest city. So we have an opportunity to think about beyond just 4 walls and a roof, how do we build that quality of life for a person? And so we are excited to launch in June 2021. And with that, really focus on three things. One, let's pool as much funding as possible to build to those values, and our health plans in Arizona have done that, and we're thankful for that. The second thing is, where do we build those communities? Where are there opportunities to link community assets? So again, if someone has a place to live, they also have a place to shop and get fresh groceries, fresh food. They have a place for their child to learn and get tutored. They have an access to get to their job easily. Where do we want to do those things? Where do we want to build? And then lastly, Rally Arizona. If you think about your first home or your best memory of your home, everybody has one. How do we evoke that in people across Arizona so they say, you know what, home is and should be for everybody. And I'm so pleased at the work Jeff's doing in thinking about home being that place. When you think about, will my kid get a good education, and really tying that to, we believe strongly that, and that's why education made those 5. You can't learn well if you don't have that safe, stable home. So kudos to the group here for putting that out there and highlighting that as we think about how we build home in the future in Arizona.
And Denise, you've done so many incredible things here in our community, and you are part of the board at Home Matters. And so you were telling me earlier about, how can we highlight hope and triumph in this space? And so what are some of the things that organization means to you?
Well, it means a lot of hope, and it means being able to bring my passion, which is around people with autism and intellectual developmental disabilities, into that portfolio of home. So when you think about Home Matters, think about what we're doing in terms of creating a full portfolio for workforce housing, for people who are seniors or vets, or we all need a place we can call home or can aspire to call home. And we know that home doesn't just happen in the 4 walls, that it's the community spaces, and our best memories are in those communities and in those schools and in those parks and those places of worship and places to work. And when our son was diagnosed 3 decades ago, we were told to love, accept, and plan to institutionalize them. And today we want people to see not only that there is hope, but there is a reality of people with autism, intellectual developmental disabilities living among us as diverse members of our community and contributing with jobs, with homes, with friends, and with the supportive community. And that's why I've been so inspired by the Home Matters principles, getting outside of, in essence, a disability bubble and being part of something bigger in terms of housing that's affordable, accessible, and attainable for more people.
So speaking of housing, and we touched on it at the top of the show, home prices, rental prices, skyrocketing, especially in the Phoenix area. In some circles, in some conversations, you say that's a good thing, the real estate market is booming. In other conversations, other circles you have, the lack of affordable housing has an incredible impact on our community. And Dave, do you want to touch on some of what that impact is, when we're talking about, yes, on one side the housing market's booming, on the other side it's creating an issue where there is lack of access to housing and affordable housing.
Absolutely, and I think there's now, even among the booming enthusiasts, a little bit of caution of, we boomed too fast, too quick. What was really attractive about Arizona being an affordable, easy place to live is blown out of the water. So I grew up here, moved and lived in 2 very expensive cities, and when we moved back, very easy to find a home, everything was affordable. Right now, nationally average, the housing rate, so where you were able to afford and not spend more than 30% of your income on your home, is $25. So roughly $50,000 a year in order to afford a 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment. You think about our average teacher salary, which I think is around low 40s in Arizona. Right now, as a teacher, you can't afford that 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment. And we're hearing it across the continuum as we look at homelessness and the number and point in time counts, which I can talk about a little later. That's increasing. You look at workforce housing, you look at engineers trying to find homes. As more and more companies want to move here for all the things that are great about Arizona, if they hit that wall like they've hit all along the coast and some of these other cities, it starts to impact the economy, which is one of the reasons why we have as one of our 5 tenets, Home Matters for the economy. If we can't balance that right and we can't get that good mix of housing, you're going to get employers who come and say, yeah, I want to move there, but where do my kids go to school? And where will we live? And so we're starting to hear more and more of those stories. I know the developers are getting together to start thinking about how we address supply, how we address mixed housing, so that we can start getting back to a more approachable way of getting people into homes rather than where we are now, which is very high.
Yeah, and you were just talking about different segments, different portions of our population, and Denise, you touched on this earlier. Like your work is focused on access for housing for supporting young adults with autism, Down syndrome, other neurodiversities. So how can you, if you can, a little insight for us on what it's like for that portion of our community trying to find affordable housing?
It's very difficult, and when you think about it, our son was diagnosed when the incidence of autism was 1 in 2,500. Today it's 1 in 44. And we have an unprecedented number of children with autism transitioning to adulthood at rates that are nationally about 70,000 people per year. And what they do is they graduate or leave high school and graduate to a couch. And you think about all the investments that we've made in early identification, early intervention, early education, and then this population slips backwards at a far greater rate than other disability groups. And so what we're doing for people with autism, intellectual developmental disabilities, is working on supportive housing. And so often when we develop it for this population, we talk about supportive housing, what they need in terms of connecting to jobs and healthcare, and we call them neurological curb cuts. You know, with the ADA 30 years ago, we have curb cuts that everyone benefits. If you're not needing them for your physical mobility, then they're good for the stroller, they're good for the grocery cart. We talk about neurological curb cuts. How do we do a better job of connecting people to the supports and services where they live so that they can live a bigger, fuller, and more productive and purposeful life? And so, so oftentimes when I feel we design it for people with autism, we design it for a pretty high order, and it works for a lot of other populations. And so in our state, we're very fortunate that with our leadership from Access and Director Jamie Snyder, and our leadership from the Department of Housing and Tom Simplot and Director Weishart from DES, that we have policy leaders who understand the challenges before us and are willing to work together and to find more innovative solutions.
And I know we mentioned it off the top, but I do want to reference the organization First Place AZ one more time, because you're talking about the great leadership you have there as well. Okay, Jeff, let's transition now. We've laid the foundation of housing as a critical component to student outcomes. So let's talk about other areas where housing impacts a family's life and who are most impacted by the lack of access to stable housing.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to say, thank you for bringing up all of these different values that Home Matters is really talking about, because I think they're really similar values, right? So thinking about not only that housing and how it impacts families, but the surrounding community. And it's something that we're talking about within All in Education as well. So education just doesn't happen in the classroom. It's not just about curriculum and teachers, but it's about the conditions of the environment in which that school system is in. And the way that we think about housing is that it's at the center of a web of different community resources, right? And in Arizona, where we have 46% of the student population being Latino and a quarter of them living in poverty, you could see that the center of this web is being overburdened by housing expenditure. So as housing costs start to mount and weigh down the center of that web, it starts to stress the connections to those other community resources, whether it's transportation or healthcare, mental health, education, summer and after school resources and programming. All of it becomes more difficult. Research shows that a family that's overburdened by housing costs are more likely not to abide by a treatment plan. They're more likely not to refill a prescription that's so important to their health. They're more likely to cut corners around nutritional expenses, right? So you start making options that are cheaper, but maybe not very nutritious, that at the end of the day jeopardizes early childhood development and a student's ability to learn. So that's nutritional cost. And now you take transportation. Back in 2015, we saw a 3% rate in car loans going 30, 60 to 90 days late. Right now, we've seen that figure balloon up to about 20%. So 1 in 5 families are in danger of losing their transportation, and you could attribute some of that to rising housing costs. So now if you're in danger of losing your transportation, you're in danger of losing your job, which means that you're in danger of losing your housing. So you go from rental property to rental property, from friends and families to eventually hotels and motels. Research also shows that children that switch schools frequently, they're more likely to not be able to succeed academically. They're more likely to be diagnosed with a learning disability. There's more bad behavior and less graduation. So again, housing being at the center of this web that pulls on that increases stress to the connections to all of these different community resources.
And Denise, I'm sitting here listening to Jeff list all these stressors, and then how does that impact a student with special needs?
Exponentially.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to it also, and I'm thinking about the return on investment. And there is a significant return on investment and a significant cost when we get it wrong. And unfortunately, there are a lot of things that we're not doing well enough right now. And so that's why it truly takes this tri-sector collaboration. We absolutely need our public policy leaders and government at the table. We also need private sector working with us, and we need the charitable sector. And that's one of the things that Home Matters as a charitable nonprofit is doing in terms of bringing all those sectors together to recognize that we can be more powerful and stronger working together. And you've just hit the heart of it. You know, communities are often judged by what's right for children, youth, and families, and our kids are a window into what we are and are not doing right.
And as we start talking about solutions, Dave, you know, there's so many different kind of cause and effect issues at play here. How much of this do you think stems from the economy and the lack of access to high-paying jobs?
Well, you look at, again, the stat that the hourly rate up for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath is $25. We've wrestled with this since we founded Home Matters and the affordability. Everyone talks about affordability. At the end of the day, 1 in 2 Americans, so 50% of America is sacrificing something in order to pay their rent, pay their mortgage. And how do you address that? It takes sums in the billions and trillions to be able to say, well, subsidize that in some way. And so what we've looked at it as, we need that investment, maybe not to the amount of $1 trillion like the defense budget has, but nationally we looked at it and said, right now our government spends about $36 billion overall when it comes to home. Let's double that. What could we do when we double that? How do we leverage tri-sector innovative ways to house people? The challenge becomes housing is so complicated, and a continuum that runs someone on the street to someone owning a home. Where do you pull the right levers in order to make it more affordable? And with inflation now still at 12% or whatever it is, I don't know how you could pay people enough in order to afford what they're trying to, what the rents look like here in Arizona, in particular with Maricopa County. So it's not an easy answer. It requires large investment, and that's where we're looking at philanthropic, corporate, state coffers, national coffers, because it will require a lot of investment to help people find that home. And what we're trying to do with Home Matters is let's start that path down when we're developing new projects and we're developing homes. Start writing some of that connectivity to other community assets in it. Build where there already are community assets and you can save on some of that cost. It needs to be rethought to some degree, reimagined to some degree about how we build home, not only in Arizona but across the country.
I like that you've been our numbers guy in this episode. So how about the recent numbers maybe on the amount of kids or students that are experiencing homelessness?
So as of the most recent point in time count, which I believe was done February earlier this year, about 9,000 people experiencing homelessness. Those are people on the street. Yeah. Of that, 22% are under 25. Wow. When you look at the 18 to 25 range, another statistic that's unpleasant and concerning is that 40% of that age group is trafficked in some way. So again, you have when you're not housed stably, all sorts of cascading effects that as you cascade down just become more and more expensive too. And so part of what we're trying to do with Home Matters and what we're looking at as social determinants of health, social determinants of education, is let's invest on the front end. When we can think about how we keep foster kids in a safe, stable home, when we can think about those with neurodiversities entering a place where they feel safe and they won't end up in housing or on the streets, That's what we want and should be investing in. When you look at the other side, the flip side, and more downstream, it just becomes all sorts of incredible costs. You look at mental health, which is now, again, a big national issue that everyone's looking at and thinking about. Let's invest on the front end. And I know, Denise, you have a pretty interesting statistic, too, of the number of 18-year-olds and their parents, and the age of their parents, and what happens when those parents pass on, and the result for those kids that have that neurodiversity.
Right, 1.4 million Americans are living with a caregiver who's 60 or older. And for those 1.4 with autism and intellectual developmental disabilities, it's a very slippery slope when something happens to mom, dad, or family member. And we do see more and more, and are receiving more and more of those calls of people who are slipping into homelessness. And not easy for anyone, but particularly when you have a child with special needs or an adult with special needs. And oftentimes that means you're not going to work. And so there's more we're doing and need to be doing together. But one of the challenges, and this is such an enormous issue, is that it seems overwhelming. So where do you start? And so what we're trying to do through Home Matters is demonstrate through the power of our example how we can create greater impact for those schools and their education rates, and for those jobs, and for those neighborhoods and safety, and to also have very specific criteria for how we fund housing and how policymakers will fund housing and supports moving forward, to make sure that it truly is connected and grounded in the community, and that somebody's grocery store shouldn't be someone's corner liquor store.
And so that's a perfect segue into what we always like to do on this series, and a call to action for our community and our community leaders. After everything we've heard today and discussed today, Jeff, we'll start with you. Like, if you had that call to action, what is it?
Well, I love what we've been talking about today, right? And it's changing our sense of societal expenditures to societal investments. We all see how poverty really increases societal expenses, but if we could invest in education, housing, the social determinants of education, or the social determinants of health, which are all in one, we could start to recoup some of those investments as higher wages, more graduation, healthier and more vibrant communities. So I love everything that we're all talking about today. One of the things that we're trying to do right now is that through our MAPA reports, we've been using data to really pinpoint what social determinants of education have the highest magnitude or the highest impact on a school system's ability to educate children. The next step, and I guess a call to action to our community, will be looking into what school systems are best able to prepare children not only for college, vocational schools, the community college, but to the actual job market and to the labor force. So what are those schools that are doing a good job? How do we spot and scale? And what are the community conditions that are necessary to be able to prepare a child for that job market of today and of tomorrow? Lastly, we have our Adelante program. So our Adelante Fellowship program is a leadership development program that attracts young leaders from different community sectors, whether it's healthcare, finance sector, engineering, housing, transportation, all these different community sectors, people that are interested and passionate about education. We allow them this fellowship experience where we onboard them onto systems change within education, and we pair that up with racial consciousness building. And alongside that, we give them an opportunity to dive into real world challenges by developing these Adelante project teams. So that in theory, we're developing the critical mass necessary to develop the leadership in our community so that they come back and we kick off collective impact efforts like we've talked about today. Because the issues are so large. But if we invest in education, we could invest our way out of a lot of these different issues.
Absolutely. And Dave, you have, you know, we talked a lot about Home Matters, but as the CEO of Valley Leadership.
I was going to put on my Valley Leadership hat for a second. And kudos to the Adelante program. Join Valley Leadership. One of our programs is basically the Vitalist social determinants of health wheel, and all the things that matter in education we spend 2 days on. But the main theme is the interconnectedness of all these things. And you talk about the redlining and everything else. We do a great presentation of a map that just overlays where are the highest incidences of poverty, where is the highest incidence of environmental pollution, of low test scores. It's the same places. And so what do we need to do when we think about investing in home? If we just invest in housing, we're doing one of those layered maps. We need to do all of them. And so my call to action, I think, would be one, view housing, if not a right, pretty damn close to a right when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and start telling a story about quality of life. Again, we start a lot of our conferences and other things as just what's home mean to you? And that evokes something for people to say, yeah, I don't immediately go to affordable housing and Cabrini Greens and all the things we think about historically when it comes to affordable housing. I think about, where do I sleep? Where do I interact with my kids and my family members? Think about that and approach your members of Congress, your council members, your mayors, your neighbors, and say, hey, shouldn't everybody have something like we have? And make it a conversation that's more about how home inspires you, gets you your next job, gets you fresh food, and talk about it that way rather than we're going straight to a subsidy for poor people. No, poor people, rich people, doesn't matter. We want home for everybody.
And Denise, you talked about starting points, so what's your call to action here?
My call to action is say yes. Say yes to welcoming that next housing development into your community. Say yes to allowing other people to have a home. Say yes to wanting to learn more about what's happening in your community and how you can reach your policymakers and others. And say yes to maybe taking another moment when you're behind somebody at the grocery store who might be struggling with some special needs to make change or whatever. Say yes to, you know what, maybe I can help. Everybody can do something in our community to help those in need. And for those of us who are privileged enough to have homes and jobs and education, we all need to say yes. Everybody can do something, and that's truly how we build community. So my hope is that we'll get more people rallying for Arizona and for more Arizonans to have the benefit of home.
Well, some fantastic call to action. So before we wrap up, I do want to give everybody the opportunity just to weigh in on some final thoughts here when it comes to housing. You know, we talked earlier how some of this stuff can at sometimes seem overwhelming when you just glance at it and you don't take a deeper look at it. So just final thoughts on how we can rally and what we should be rallying as we wrap up this conversation on housing. And Dave, we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, just to echo Denise, it's saying yes and having the conversation. You know, when we developed Home Matters and actually the logo, we told the graphic person, the designer, pretend you're sitting at home, there's a family sitting at home and they're writing on their kitchen table and it's the first time in their new home. And they write Home Matters. Like, that's what we want to evoke. And this guy in Brooklyn, that's handwritten, it's not font, our logo. And we want that. Think about your home. Think about where you want your kids to live, learn, you know, all the things that you grew up when you think about home, and put that first. All the other complicated stuff of policy and who deserves it and who doesn't, yeah, we got to sort through that, but if you can start with home as a quality of life thing, and yeah, everybody should have the best of it as possible, we can have the conversations from there. And I would say yes to doing it civilly, yes to the conversation having, which is becoming a lost art in this country. I think people just quickly go to the policy and the back and forth. Start with what connects people.
Denise?
Yes, I would love for people to say yes to a survey and a market analysis that we're pushing out in August. And it will be the first Greater Phoenix market housing analysis for people with autism and intellectual developmental disabilities, so that we better understand through data what's needed and what people want. And you can't do it all at once as much as we wish that we could. So figure out what those next steps are. And for us, it's modeling housing and opportunities. It's also better understanding what the marketplace needs so that data can live with other data and we can create collectively more healthy housing plans for our communities close to where people live.
And Jeff, you know, you, Anais, Stephanie, the entire team at All Education does an incredible job of bringing these conversations to the table. So help us wrap up here as we end this episode on housing. Just some final thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you again. I think pendulums swing, right? And I think right now we're in an extreme where we're at each other's throats, and you know we can't have a dialogue around solutions. But these conversations give me hope. When I was in college, I remember thinking to myself, master's in social work ASU, like, why can't we just work together? Being like that naive young college student, right? Like, why can't we just work together? But when I think about vitalist, healthy elements of a community, when I think about the social determinants of education, when I think about Home Matters and the work that you all are doing, it gives me hope, and it sheds a light on how important it is to think collectively for the greater good, and I think we see the roots of it today. And a special thank you to the Garcia Family Foundation for making all of this possible.
Yeah, we appreciate all of our leaders coming together to have these conversations, and we know now how we can play a role, continuing to reiterating the conversation points we discussed here today. I want to thank everyone for joining us for All in Education's Paque Sepas, the social determinants of education. As a reminder, we will continue building on this conversation every single month, bringing you a deep dive conversation around each of the topics. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David. Thank you, Denise. And you mentioned the Garcia family. We do want to recognize the Garcia family one more time. I believe we have a graphic we can pull up on the screen, but they've done such a tremendous job in working with All Education, correct?
Correct.
All right, thank you so much, and be sure to tune in next month for Paque Sepas.